They earn well, very well. On paper, everything indicates they should be comfortable, but, for some reason difficult to explain, the money seems to evaporate before the end of the month. If you only look at the numbers, nothing makes sense. And that's exactly where the problem lies. Imagine an ordinary couple. Not millionaires, not heirs. Just two adults who did everything they were told would work. She works in marketing, earning just over $60,000 a year. He's in technology, making over $70,000. Together, they make more than $130,000 annually. This comfortably places them among the highest-paid households in the country. Statistically, they should be winning the game, but they are not. They wake up early every day. They race against the clock. They gulp down coffee, face traffic, endless meetings, tight deadlines. They arrive home tired, with the constant feeling that life is happening too fast. They talk little during the week, almost always about bills, commitments, what's left undone. At the end of the month, when they look at their bank account, the silent question arises, where did all the money go? They have some savings, but not much, maybe 2 months' worth of expenses if they're optimistic. When the car breaks down, the repair goes on the credit card. When an unexpected medical expense arises, the relief is accompanied by anxiety. There's no sense of security. There's constant vigilance, a permanent state of alertness, as if something is about to go wrong. And the most disconcerting thing is that they weren't wrong. They studied. They got qualified. They entered the job market. They advanced in their careers. They got married. They consolidated their finances. They bought a house in a neighborhood considered good, with decent schools, exactly as everyone advises. They don't live in excessive luxury. They don't spend on absurd extravagances. Yet, they feel they are always one step behind, always running to avoid falling. This creates an internal conflict that's difficult to admit, because when you earn well, it doesn't seem legitimate to complain. There's guilt. There's shame. How do you explain that? Even with a high income, you feel financially fragile. How do you say that the fear isn't of losing comfort, but of losing your footing? Achisomi point A question arises that no one likes to ask aloud. If we're doing everything right, why does it still seem so wrong? This feeling is not uncommon. On the contrary, millions of couples experience this paradox. They look at the total amount of money coming in each month and think, we earn too much money to feel this way. But the feeling doesn't go away. It grows. It seeps into conversations, decisions, and sleepless nights. There's a silent tension in this kind of life, a total dependence on everything continuing to function perfectly. 2 jobs need to keep existing. 2 incomes need to come in without interruption. Nobody can get sick. Nobody can stop. Nobody can fail. Because any deviation, any unforeseen event, threatens to dismantle the entire structure. And that's tiring. It's more tiring than the work itself. It tires the mind. It tires the relations. Tires the futuri. Because, despite all the effort, the feeling isn't one of progress. It's one of constant maintenance. As if all the energy is being used just to stay in the same place. The curiosity begins precisely there. If this couple is at the top of the income pyramid and yet lives under pressure, what does that say about the system as a whole? At what point did a high income cease to be synonymous with tranquility? When exactly did financial security become a rare privilege, even among those who seemingly made it? Perhaps the problem isn't individual choices. Perhaps it's not a matter of lack of control, nor irresponsibility, nor bad decisions. Perhaps the mistake lies in the very promise that has been sold for decades. The idea that combining to salaries automatically creates stability. This promise seems so logical that almost no one questions it. To earn more than one, therefore, to should live better than one. What if this calculation is incomplete? What if, instead of strengthening, this sum is creating a dangerous dependency? Observe how this life is constructed. Every important decision stems from an invisible assumption both will continue working. The house is chosen based on this combined income. The financing is approved because both salaries exist. The cars, the commitments, the standard of living, everything is scaled to function only if neither gear stops. There is no slack, there is no damping, there is only continuity. This creates a permanent microconflict, even when nothing is explicitly wrong. A diffuse fear that stability is fragile, that success is conditional, that comfort depends on an endless sequence of if everything continues as it is. And perhaps that's why so many well-paid couples feel trapped. Trapped in routines they can't change. Trapped in jobs they can't leave. Trapped in decisions made based on large numbers, but small margins. What's most intriguing is that this feeling didn't exist in the same way in the past. Lower-income families had more breathing room. They had a greater capacity to absorb shocks. They had a kind of invisible reserve that has now disappeared. Something was lost along the way, but it's rarely named. This is the part that nobody explains in school, in career conversations, or in traditional financial advice. Because looking only at the amount of money coming into your account doesn't reveal the complete picture. What matters isn't just how much you earn, but how much you depend on continuing to earn exactly that amount without interruption. If you've ever felt this discomfort, this anxiety that's hard to justify, this feeling of always being on the verge of something, even with a high income, then this isn't an isolated problem. It's a pattern, a modern pattern, silent and extremely common. The question that remains is not whether this couple is irresponsible. The real question is another, much more uncomfortable one. Was the entire model designed to appear progressive when in reality it reduced our margin of error? In the next part, we'll dismantle the central promise that underpins this model and show why something that seems obvious in mathematics doesn't work in real life. Because if the salary should bring security, why do so many families feel the exact opposite? There's an idea that seems so obvious that almost no one dares to question it. It's present in family conversations, financial planning, career decisions, and even bank advertisements. The idea is simple. Two salaries are better than one. It seems like basic math. It seems like common sense. It seems impossible that it could be wrong. Imagine a common scenario. A person supports a household earning $50,000 a year. They pay rent bills, food, transportation, school. There's not much left over, but it's enough to live on. Now, imagine two people earning $50,000 each, $100,000 in total. Logically, this family should live better and still save money easily. Have to live on half the future. Simple, direct, comforting. That was precisely the logic that guided an entire generation. For decades, women's entry into the workforce was celebrated as a positive revolution in every sense. More independence, more income, more security. And, in many respects, this was true. The problem is that, along with this change, came a silent promise. Now that there are two salaries, everything will be easier. But something strange happened along the way. Families started working more, not less. Total income increased. But the feeling of security did not keep pace with this growth. On the contrary, anxiety became part of daily life. The fear of losing one's job became a shared responsibility, not a dispersed one. And the extra money, which theoretically should create financial relief, never seemed to actually materialize. Think about how these decisions happen in practice. A couple sits down to choose a house. The real estate agent looks at their combined income and says, "You can finance this amount." The bank agrees. The payment fits within the budget, provided both continue working. So the house is no longer chosen based on what one salary can afford, but rather based on what two salaries allow. The same thing happens with cars, with the neighborhood, with school, with lifestyle. None of this appears as an excess or immediate luxury. It appears as something compatible with income. The problem is that this income is doubled, and commitments begin to demand that it remain doubled forever. Here's where the less intuitive part of the story comes in. When two incomes become the norm, they cease to be a competitive advantage and become a minimum requirement. It's not that you live better by having two salaries. It's that you only need them to live at the same level that previously required one. This creates an invisible trap because nobody wakes up one day and consciously decides, I'm going to build a life that depends entirely on two jobs. It happens gradually, decision after decision, all seemingly rational. Each step makes sense in isolation. It's the combination that becomes dangerous. And it was precisely this pattern that caught the attention of researchers years ago. By analyzing thousands of families that had gone bankrupt, they discovered something that contradicted everything that was believed about economic security. Families with two working adults were not more protected against crises. They were more vulnerable. This sounds absurd at first glance. More income should mean more protection. But what the data showed was something else. When life is structured to consume all available income, any interruption becomes a disaster. There is no cushion. There is no plan B. There is only mandatory continuity. Let's bring this to a common scenario. Imagine a couple where both work full-time. One of them gets sick and needs to take time off for a few months. Their income drops immediately, but their expenses remain exactly the same. The mortgage doesn't decrease. The car loan doesn't pause. The cost of health insurance doesn't disappear. Everything was calculated to work with two active salaries. What should be a period of recovery turns into a desperate race to avoid falling behind on bills. Now imagine a different scenario. One of the partners loses their job, not due to incompetence, but due to cost-cutting, restructuring, something common in the modern market. The family income drops by half from one month to the next. There is no transition. There is no gradual adaptation. The entire structure is at risk. This is where the promise of two salaries begins to reveal its fragility. Because it doesn't create resilience, it creates dependency. There is also an important psychological aspect. When you see a high number in your total income, your perception changes. You feel entitled to spend more, not out of irresponsibility, but because everything around you reinforces this idea. Banks approve credit. Dealerships offer larger financing plans. The entire market begins to treat that income as secure and permanent. But income is not a guarantee. It's cash flow, and cash flow can stop. What makes this situation even more treacherous is that, in everyday life, it doesn't seem like a trap. It looks like progress. It looks like financial maturity. It looks like success. Two productive, independent people, contributing equally. All of that is true. The problem is what happens when this model is taken to the extreme, without any margin for error. Few people realize that the second salary, which should serve as a safety net, is consumed by fixed costs even before it reaches the account. It ceases to be a reserve and becomes a requirement. What should provide freedom ends up taking away options. This is where the most uncomfortable surprise arises. Working more didn't guarantee more security. In many cases it less. Because the system adapted quickly to the new reality. Prices weren't changed. The standard of living was recalibrated to absorb every extra dollar. And this didn't happen because of a conspiracy. It happened because of dynamics. When more money entered the system, prices asked, when everyone has two incomes become the new normal, and the normal ceases to offer protection. Perhaps you've felt this without being able to name it. The feeling that, despite all the effort, there is no rest, that there is no room for error, that a poorly calculated decision, an unforeseen medical event, or a dismissal could unravel everything. This is not a personal failing. It is the result of an incomplete promise. The promise that two salaries would solve the problem, without considering what would happen when the entire world began to operate on the same logic. In the next part, we'll go back in time to understand how lower-income families managed to achieve something that seems rare today, a safety margin. Because, before understanding how to escape this trap, it's necessary to understand exactly when and why it was set. To understand how we got here, we need to step outside the present for a few minutes and look back without nostalgia, just with clarity. Mentally return to the beginning of the 1970s. It's not an idealized world. There were real problems, clear inequalities, and significant limitations. But there was something structurally different in the way financial life was organized for most middle-class families. During that period, the dominant pattern was simple: one main provider and one caregiver. In many cases, the father were outside the home, mother took of the house and children. Not because this was perfect or fair, but because it was economically viable. A single salary, considered average for the time, was enough to support an entire family without every decision being made on a shoestring budget. And here comes the first break in expectations. We're not talking about barely surviving. We're talking about having a margin. Families were able to pay for housing, food, transportation, basic healthcare, public education, and still save money. There was room for error. There was room for a pause. How was this possible with lower incomes than we have now? The answer begins to emerge when we look at the cost structure of that time. Housing consumed a smaller portion of income. Healthcare didn't require expensive and complex plans. Basic education didn't depend on expensive zip codes to function well. And, perhaps the most ignored point today, there was no structural need to pay for childcare on a large scale because someone was already at home. This completely changes a family's financial balance. Now, imagine this scenario carefully. A family living on a main salary and, at the same time, possessing latent income. A potential not yet activated. If something went wrong, if the main provider lost their job or became ill, there was a clear alternative. The other adult could enter the job market. It wasn't the ideal plan, but it was a plan. A real buffer. How many families today have this type of cushioning? This detail is crucial and almost never appears in modern comparisons. The second salary wasn't necessary to maintain basic living conditions. It existed as a possibility, not an obligation. This created a kind of security that didn't show up in the bank account, but made all the difference when something unexpected happened. Fast forward a few decades. Gradually, this second salary ceases to be an emergency option and becomes incorporated into the monthly budget. At first, it seems like an obvious improvement. More money comes in. Life seems more comfortable. But, simultaneously, something silent begins to change. Prices adjust. When more families start having two active incomes, the market responds. Houses begin to be bought based on this new ability to pay. Prices go up. What was once affordable with one salary now requires two. The standard of living doesn't just rise for some, it rises for everyone. And here's an uncomfortable question. If everyone increases their purchasing power at the same time, does anyone actually get richer? This phenomenon doesn't only happen in housing. It spreads to other pillars of life. Higher quality public schools become concentrated in more expensive neighborhoods. To access a decent education, the price of housing goes up. It's not a school tuition fee, but it functions like one. The cost is embedded in the financing. The same thing happens with healthcare. As the system becomes more complex, private plans become almost mandatory. Costs rise. Coverage becomes more expensive. And, once again, salaries are seen as necessary to cover the basics. With each adjustment, the extra income doesn't create any leeway. It's absorbed. And perhaps the most profound change is not economic, but psychological. When two incomes become the norm, risk ceases to be shared and becomes accumulated. Before, losing a job was a serious problem, but there was a way to cope. Now, losing a job can mean losing your home, your health insurance, your entire stability. Do you realize how this completely changes your relationship with work? Employment ceases to be merely a source of income and becomes an anchor, something that cannot be abandoned, something that needs to function continuously. This creates a kind of structural anxiety, even when everything seems to be going well. Notice how this affects life decisions. Having children becomes a delicate financial equation. Any break from work becomes a huge risk. Caring for a sick relative becomes a logistical and economic problem at the same time. There is no room for improvisation. And here, another important question arises. When exactly did we normalize living without margins? The contrast with the past becomes even more evident when we realize that, despite all the limitations of that time, there was a clear separation between basic cost and improved quality of life. Today, many improvements have been reclassified as necessities. A second car is not a luxury, it's logistics. An expensive health plan is not a choice, it's prevention. A more expensive neighborhood is not ostentation, it's access. None of this seems like an exaggeration in isolation. The problem is the whole picture. When we add all these elements together, we realize that the modern structure demands that everything function perfectly all the time. There is no systemic slack. There is no acceptable pause. The entire model depends on continuity, and this creates a cruel paradox. We've never had so many tools, so much technology, and so much productivity, but it's never been so risky to stop. It's never been so dangerous to slow down. It's never been so difficult to make mistakes. Have you ever wondered why so many people feel like they're always running, even when they earn well? The answer is starting to become clear here. It's not just a matter of income. It's a matter of structural design. The current model transforms any unforeseen event into a threat because it eliminates the invisible reserves that existed before. What was once an option has become an obligation. What was once a margin has become a minimum line. What was once security has become mere appearance. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all is realizing that this didn't happen abruptly. There wasn't a clear moment of rupture. It was a slow, normalized transition, celebrated as progress. Only now are we beginning to perceive the hidden cost. In the next part, we'll put numbers to this story and show how, in practice, the second salary is consumed even before fulfilling its intended purpose. Because understanding the structure is important, but seeing the direct impact on daily life is what truly changes how you view your own choices. Now, let's move away from abstract ideas and into the territory where everything becomes uncomfortably concrete. Because understanding the structure helps, but nothing has a greater impact than seeing where the money actually goes. Not the imagined money, not the pretty annual rent number, but the real money that's left over after life takes its toll. Imagine an ordinary couple. Nothing extreme. One of them earns $70,000 a year, the other $50,000. Together, $120,000. That number sounds impressive. It conveys success. It gives the feeling that there is room for choice. But let's isolate the second salary and observe it carefully, as if it were an experiment. Even before that money reaches the account, it starts to shrink. Taxes come first, not as punishment, but structurally. In a progressive system, the second salary goes on top of the pile. It is taxed at the highest rates. When we add federal, state, and labor charges, it's no exaggeration to say that 35% disappear immediately. Those 50,000 are no longer 50. They are little more than 32 or 35. You haven't spent anything yet. You've only worked. Now, bring children into this equation, something extremely common in dual-income families. Someone needs to take care of the children during the day. Daycare is not optional. It's infrastructure. The average annual cost per child is around $15,000. In many cities, it's more. 2 children, $30,000. The second salary, which had already been reduced by taxes, now practically disappears. But let's be generous. Imagine just one child, $15,000 for daycare. The total drops to something closer to $18,000 or $20,000. And we're still a long way from the end. The working adults mean to complete routines outside the home, to daily commutes. 2 sets of transportation expenses: fuel, maintenance, vehicle wear and tear, parking. Studies estimate that this cost can easily reach $5,000 per year per person. In many cases, more. If a second car is needed, the bill grows rapidly with financing, insurance, and taxes. Let's use a conservative figure: $8,000 per year, directly associated with the fact that the person works outside the home. The second salary is now dangerously close to $10,000. And here comes a part that is almost never clearly calculated: the cost of exhaustion. When 2 adults spend the entire day working, time ceases to be merely scarce. It becomes too precious to be spent on household chores. Cooking every day becomes an exception. Cleaning the house on weekends becomes a burden. Maintenance, organization, everything starts to be outsourced or simplified with more expensive solutions. Takeout, delivery, eating out, occasional cleaning services. Small expenses that don't seem large individually, but which, added up over the year, create a real impact. Research shows that dual-income families spend significantly more on convenience items than families where one adult has more free time. Add another $5,000 to $10,000 per year to that figure. Again, being conservative. Now, stop for a moment and observe the result. From a gross salary of $50,000, perhaps $2,000 or $3,000 remain net at the end of the year. In some scenarios, less. In others, the amount is negative. This means that someone worked full-time, stayed away from family, lived under constant pressure and fatigue to generate an almost symbolic return. And here arises a question that's hard to ignore. If it had been presented this way from the beginning, would the decision have seemed so obvious? What makes all this even more treacherous is that nobody does this calculation explicitly. Decisions are made based on total income, not net contribution. The couple sees $120,000 and thinks like those who earn $120,000. The market reinforces this. Banks approve credit. Financing is offered. Everything seems to confirm that income is solid. But the foundation of this solidity is fragile. This illusion creates a powerful psychological effect. When the large number appears on the annual paycheck, it masks the fact that much of that money is already committed before it's even received. Life is built on a gross amount that was never truly available, and that's how the trap closes without fanfare. Families buy houses that only make sense with two active incomes. They take on installments that cannot be sustained by just one. They enter into long-term commitments based on an ideal, not resilient, scenario. Everything works as long as nothing goes wrong. But life rarely respects ideal scenarios. A promotion that doesn't come, a boss who changes, a company that cuts costs, a health problem, a child who needs more attention. Any of these situations reduces or eliminates that second salary, and suddenly, what seemed like abundance reveals its true nature, dependence. There's a fact that often surprises those who consider themselves financially stable. A huge percentage of adults can't cover a relatively small emergency without resorting to credit or selling something, and many of them belong to middle or upper-income families. It's not a lack of rent, it's a lack of financial resources. The second salary, which should have created that margin, was used to inflate the standard of living to the limit of what was possible, not out of irresponsibility, but because the system pushed in that direction. When everyone does it, it seems normal. When someone doesn't, it seems like they're falling behind. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of this dynamic is this: the expenses that consume the second salary are not superfluous. They are not obvious luxuries. They are basic costs of modern life: housing, childcare, transportation, food. Nobody is buying yachts. They are just trying to maintain what is considered normal today. This completely changes the narrative of individual blame. It's not about spending poorly. It's about a model that demands everything you earn just to function. When you realize this, something changes. The question stops being how to earn more and becomes, why didn't earning more solve the problem? This shift in perspective is uncomfortable, but necessary, because in the next part, we're going to show the exact moment when this structure ceases to be merely tight and becomes dangerous. The point at which any unforeseen event transforms a seemingly stable life into a real crisis. There comes a specific point when this structure ceases to be merely cramped and transforms into something truly dangerous. It doesn't happen with a sound. It doesn't come with a warning. Most of the time, it starts with something small, almost banal, a detail that's off script. It could be an unexpected call from work, an email that's too short, a meeting scheduled at an inconvenient time. It could be a medical exam that requires further investigation. It could be a child who starts needing more attention than anticipated. None of these things, in isolation, seem like a breakdown, but it's at this point that the trap reveals its true nature. Because when life is structured to function within the constraints of two incomes. Any reduction doesn't create discomfort, it creates risk. Imagine a couple who depend entirely on both salaries to pay their fixed expenses. The mortgage, health insurance, car loan, childcare, insurance, everything was planned for that entire monthly income. Now, imagine that one of the partners needs to stop working for 3 months. Not forever, just 3 months. It seems like a short time, but observe the chain reaction. Income drops immediately. Bills don't. Housing costs remain the same. Health insurance continues to be charged. Daycare, often, too. Financing doesn't pause. The financial clock keeps ticking, indifferent to human reality. What should be a period of recovery turns into an exercise in survival. This is the central point of the trap. It eliminates tolerance for error. There is no cushioning. There is no room to absorb impact. Everything works as long as everything else works. When something fails, everything fails together. And the cruelest part is that this doesn't only affect families living on the edge. It affects families that, on paper, seem solid. High incomes, stable careers, reputable financial history. Yet, they are still vulnerable. There is a fundamental difference between income and resilience. And the modern model has confused the two. Resilience doesn't come from how much money comes in each month. It comes from the ability to keep going when income stops coming in. It comes from the flexibility to adjust without collapsing. And that has been, little by little, removed from the equation. When both adults are already working at maximum capacity, there is no possible lateral movement. There is no internal plan B. There is no one else to step in. The card has already been played. This is a profound change from the past. Before, a loss of income triggered a response. Today, it triggers a crisis. This helps explain why so many couples feel a constant fear, even when everything seems fine. It's not paranoia. It's intuition. The system they're in doesn't allow for mistakes. And human beings fail. They get sick, they get tired. They need to stop. They need to choose. When this need arises, conflict is immediate. It's not just financial. It's emotional. Guilt, pressure, fear. One partner feels responsible for keeping everything running. The other feels trapped in a role they can't abandon. The relationship begins to revolve around maintaining the structure, not life itself. This is the point at which many people begin to realize that something is wrong, but they can't name it. They feel they've gained more life than they can emotionally sustain, not for lack of ability, but for lack of leeway. There is also a silent risk that is rarely discussed. Risk concentration. When both salaries come from the same market, the same region, or sectors sensitive to the economic cycle, the vulnerability multiplies. A recession, a technological shift, or a sectoral restructuring can affect both at the same time. Diversification, which is so strongly advocated in investment, has been abandoned in real life. Even when jobs are different, fixed costs don't distinguish the source of income. They simply require that income continues to exist. The result is a total dependence on factors beyond individual control. This is one of the reasons why studies show higher rates of financial collapse precisely among families that, theoretically, should be protected, not because they made more mistakes, but because they had less room for error. The system doesn't punish the error. It punishes the interruption. Now, think about how this affects future decisions. A partner might want to change careers, accept a lower salary temporarily, start a business, or study something new. The idea is quickly dismissed, not because it's bad, but because it's too risky within that structure. The cost of failure is too high. Another person would like to reduce their working hours to care for children or an elderly relative. They can't. The budget doesn't allow it. Life has been structured in a way that demands constant presence at work, even when that presence would be more valuable elsewhere. This is not economic freedom. It is dependency disguised as success. And here emerges a truth that is difficult to accept. Many families are not failing financially. They are simply trapped in a model that allows no slack. They are operating like a machine tuned to the maximum, with no room for maintenance. Everything seems efficient until one part wears out. Perhaps the biggest problem with this trap is how normalized it is. When everyone lives like this, it seems like there's no alternative. Tiredness becomes the norm. Anxiety becomes routine. The idea that adult life is necessarily exhausting spreads. But this is not inevitable. It is a consequence of structural choices made without full awareness of the cost. When you understand this point, something starts to change. The question stops being how to keep this working and becomes, is it worth continuing to work this way? Because if your stability depends on nothing going wrong, you don't have stability. You have temporary luck. In the next part, we'll talk specifically about the way out, not a magic solution, nor a nostalgic return to the past, but a change in logic, a way to rebuild real security in a world that seems to demand everything from you all the time. We've reached the most delicate point in this whole conversation, because understanding the trap is uncomfortable, but liberating. What truly changes your life, however, is deciding what to do with that understanding. Knowledge without action only increases frustration. The good news is that there is a way out. It's not simple, it's not quick, and it's not popular, but it's real. Before any practical plan, something deeper than the budget needs to be adjusted. How you define security. For a long time, we've been led to believe that financial security means earning more, improving your standard of living, and increasing visible comfort. But security isn't about appearances. Security is the ability to absorb impact without collapsing. It's being able to make mistakes without losing everything. It's having a choice when life demands change. And this change begins with a clear mental decision to treat the second salary not as an acquired right, but as a strategic resource. Most families do the exact opposite. They assume that both incomes are permanent, guaranteed, and untouchable. Based on this, their lives. The result is a rigid structure that doesn't tolerate failure. The alternative requires reversing this logic. It requires building a life as if only one income existed, even when two are coming in. This seems daunting at first glance. It seems like a step backward. It seems like giving up comfort. But in practice, it's the path to recovering something that was lost: margin. The first concrete step is to look at your fixed costs with radical honesty. Housing, transportation, debt, education, everything that can't be easily adjusted month to month. Ask yourself, without self-deception, if one of your incomes disappeared tomorrow, how long could this structure sustain itself? 1 month? 2? None. This question is not meant to create guilt. It's meant to bring clarity. From there, the goal is simple to define, although difficult to execute, to make these fixed costs fit into a single income, not the total income. Squan. This doesn't mean you need to do it overnight. It means that this becomes the guiding principle for all future decisions. This might mean living in a smaller house or a less desirable neighborhood. It might mean keeping a car longer or giving up a second vehicle. It might require saying no to standards that seem normal because everyone around follows them. None of these choices are comfortable in the short term. All of them are liberating in the long term. Meanwhile, the second salary completely changes its function. It ceases to be fuel to keep the system running and becomes a tool for construction. It doesn't pay for life. It builds the future. In practice, this means directing that money toward very specific goals. First, a real emergency fund capable of supporting the family for several months without any income. Not a symbolic amount, a reserve that truly buys peace of mind. Then, long-term investments, retirement savings, assets that grow over time. Every real invested is a fraction of freedom purchased. This process transforms the relationship with work. Employment ceases to be a prison and becomes a choice. Perhaps it will still be necessary for many years, but it is no longer mandatory at any cost. This changes everything. There is also an emotional transformation that happens along the way. Anxiety decreases. Conversations about money become less tense. The constant fear that something will go wrong begins to lose its power. Not because nothing can go wrong, but because, if it does, you won't fall into the abyss. It's important to be honest. This plan takes time. It's not an instant turnaround. It takes years. 5, maybe 10. But the cumulative effect is powerful. Achisomi points something curious happen. The investments start generating income. The reserves provide security. And that feeling of always being in a rush begins to disappear. You don't become rich overnight. You become resilient. And that's rarer. It's also important to understand that this path isn't about rejecting progress or romanticizing the past. It's about using the present wisely. It's about realizing that not everything you can afford is something you should sustain. That not every credit approval is a green light to move forward. True modern luxury isn't a bigger house. It's being able to say no. No to a toxic job. No to a debilitating pace of life. No to a choice that demands sacrificing everything that matters. This is only possible when there's room for maneuver. Perhaps you're thinking that this doesn't apply to your reality, that your costs are already too high, that there's no room for adjustment. This feeling is common, but there's almost always some leverage, some future decision that hasn't yet been made, a next step that could be different. It's not about guilt for the past. It's about intention for the future. And here comes the final reflection. The dual income trap isn't, at its core, about money. It's about flexibility. It's about preserving the ability to react. Our grandparents had less visible comfort, but more space to absorb shocks. In exchange for bigger houses and better cars, we give up this invisible protection. The question now isn't whether the world will change. It always changes. The question is whether you're going to continue building your life as if nothing could go wrong. Because having two incomes isn't a problem. The problem is when both are already committed before they even arrive. The problem is when your security depends on continuous perfection in an imperfect world. If this video made you look at your own life more clearly, then it served its purpose. If any part caused discomfort, that's also a sign. Real change almost always starts this way. If you want to continue exploring this type of reflection, subscribe to the channel. If this content helped you, like the video. And if you want, leave a comment sharing your experience or question. You can do this anonymously. Many people are going through exactly what you are going through, even if they don't talk about it. Understanding the trap is the first step. Choosing to get out of it is the next.